I just wanted to jump in with some questions, and then I know Edward has some questions as well. My first question really goes to geography. If you could talk about Iceland basically as an island and its borders and its size, which looks to be a little bit smaller than New York State, and how that might have influenced culture and these migratory peoples, and how those different groups may have interacted because of the geography.
Yes, so Iceland as a place is very far removed from mainland Scandinavia, from the British Isles, and even from Greenland, that is somewhat closer. And the journey in a Viking ship has been estimated to be about between, I think it is 2 and 3 weeks from the Norwegian west coast. And it is a perilous journey, of course, when you're sailing across the North Atlantic in these boats. And the distances in Iceland at the time would have been pretty considerable. You wouldn't meet a lot of people traveling through the landscape. You would probably prefer to sail in many cases rather than traveling by foot. And although we do see in the saga literature and in other historical documents that people did cross the inland of Iceland on horseback, but that it is actually it can be quite dangerous to actually do that. As we know, Iceland is one of the most geologically active places on the planet, and there are other kinds of dangers. Of course, we're dealing with a subarctic country, so we also have cold and wind and fog and many other things that still represents a danger to people today. We often see a tourist who's hiking in Iceland basically disappearing because they run into fog and such things. So Iceland is not necessarily a very welcoming place for people. And this is also one of the first realizations that we see in the Book of Settlements. We have the man who gave the name Iceland to the country, this man named Hrafnafloki. He is said to have sailed there, and then he built a settlement. And then he let his animals graze, and then he started fishing, and then he got so preoccupied with fishing that he forgot to collect enough feed for the animals, and when winter came, they died. And then he was looking over the fjord, and he saw that it was completely iced over, and he called the country Iceland, and then he left again. What this is a curious little story, but it's also actually, sort of a cultural cautionary tale, telling us, this is a different type of place than what we see in the places in Europe that these settlers came from. Aside from that, of course, as isolated as it is, Iceland has not had a lot of problems with invasion forces. There weren't anybody. Well, actually, we do have a saga that says that Harald Bluetooth, the king of Denmark in the late 10th century, was trying to build an army to go invade Iceland. And he then ditched that project again because of these various fairy tale creatures that his scouts saw up there. So, of course, this is a fantastical tale, but there is some truth to this in the sense that, if you were a Viking warlord in Scandinavia, maybe Iceland was not the first place you wanted to go to try to conquer. England is much more, suitable for that. Green pastures and all of that stuff. So, so that's one thing that we can, of course, say that Iceland was very isolated in a sense. And the journey there was problematic. And the individuals living in Iceland would also have some reasonable distance between each other.
Got it. So in terms of geography, because it was difficult to get to, and because each of these groups had some distance between each other, would that be justification to say that maybe government was not as necessary in terms of defending, different territories?
I would definitely say so, and in the sense that we don't have the same types of threats that we have in the Norwegian fjords or in the rolling hills of Denmark, or the rolling hills of England, for that matter. We have a sparse population and a lot of distance between them. But on the other hand, in Iceland, resource collection is different from the rest of Scandinavia, except for perhaps the northern parts of Norway, in the sense that you don't have access to it's not as productive in an agrarian country as the rest of Scandinavia is. And so that could be an incentive for people, which I think we also see in the saga literature. A lot of the saga literature is about somebody trying to appropriate others' property. And the reason for that would probably be that there was a scarcity of resource. We also see that Iceland had problems with people raiding each other, and this also happens in the medieval period. They even have to make laws about not stealing each other's wives and such things. So there is a scarcity of resource in Iceland that might be prompting more violence than you would see in a similar isolated island nation under more favorable conditions.
Yeah, that makes good sense. All right, I'm going to jump over to Edward. I know that he's got some questions here. So go ahead, Edward. What did you want to ask?
Thank you. So Mathias, what would you say the timeline for migration was? When was the first significant settlement founded? Who founded it? And who then contributed over the next several centuries to the populations?
So what the most recent excavations have uncovered is that a site called Stöðvarðarfjörður on the eastern side of Iceland. It was founded around 800, and we don't know much about these peoples. What I have read about this the excavation is that there seems to have been a considerable Sami population too. So that what is considered the indigenous peoples of northern Scandinavia were part of this migration. This we also know from some written material from Iceland. But the legendary first settler was Ingólfur Agnarsson, who came in 870 something. So what other archaeological excavations in the city center of Reykjavik have uncovered a house that was built around 871 to 2. That it has been dated because of an ash layer from a volcanic eruption that has covered the surface of it. And this, by some, of course, has been called Ingólfur's site, because the medieval histories are telling us that he went into the Bay of Reykjavik. So it's probably not that. I don't think it's particularly problematic, so to speak, to say that it might have been. It could have been. Who knows? But it looks like that area of the Reykjavik Bay and Borgarfjörður, a little north of there, and also Breiðafjörður are some of the sites that become quickly and heavily populated in the early period. And so we have Ingólfur, who comes there in the 870s, and then we have people following after. And to speak a little towards this problem I mentioned before about the sagas of Icelanders saying that the Norwegian king was part of the problem and the reason that people left. I don't think that that's entirely untrue. The reason that it's not mentioned in the early sources, I mean, there could be many reasons for that. But there's probably some portion of the population in Scandinavia who decides to leave because there is opportunity elsewhere, and that is at the base root the opportunity to create your own type of society and become your own master in a sense. But aside from that, what we're seeing are two early assemblies, Kjalarnes and Thorsnes, in the western part of Iceland before the General Assembly at Þingvellir is established. So it looks like we have two governments, so to speak, or ruling bodies that are competing in the very early beginning. And then later on, they decide to found the Alþingi, the General Assembly in Þingvellir. And what we know historically is that this type of government, this sort of a council that where we have the foremost members of society, you could even call them oligarchs, representing themselves and the populations that live in their territory or have sworn allegiance to them. This is a very early, very old Germanic type of government, and we have this, as the literature also tells us, this they use the Western Norwegian laws as the basic framework for creating the Icelandic law at the Alþingi, and this is of course because they're going on traditional systems in different ways. And we know these forms of assemblies also from the rest of Scandinavia and from early Germanic periods in the German area. So the Icelanders are more sort of establishing a society based on tradition than on a new type of ideology. I know that Icelanders would like to call their country the first democracy, but I think that's a bit of a stretch if we start digging into it historically.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. And regarding the antisocial nature of many of the Vikings and the Icelanders, it sounds like, at least while you were talking about it, it sounded like the more settled an area gets, the more interconnected the different families and the different groups become. And then when you migrate to the Western US or to Iceland, you end up disrupting all of those relationships, and people become much more self-sufficient and less dependent on these relationships, not because they don't necessarily want those relationships, but because they've been disrupted, and it takes a long time to rebuild those deep relationships between different communities. Could that be a part of why the Vikings had this antisocial behavior complex?
That is a possibility. Yeah, there is. This is my own personal theory, but for me, there seem to be two types of human beings on the planet. There are the sedentary ones, and then there are the migratory ones. The migratory ones, they move because of opportunistic reasons. They go to the place in the world where the situation seems to be most fortuitous, in a sense, and I think that would be the type of people who would be the first ones to leave for a place like Iceland, just like they were the first ones to leave for a place like North America. And yeah, that does disrupt some aspects of the established fabric of society in the parent cultures. But on the other hand, what we see in Iceland is also this, aside from the so-called goðorð, these chieftaincies that were sort of the constitutional bodies of belonging to the people who had the voting rights in the Althingi. We also have the Hreppur, which is a word that can probably best be translated to communes. These seem to be old, and they especially gain a function in context of the establishing of the church and the collecting of tithes, where they become the primary bodies through which taxes are collected. But they seem to be older than the establishment of the church in Iceland. And their primary functions were to actually ensure some kind of even distribution and safety net. It's sort of a welfare system. They are primarily there for poor relief, but you also, if you, for instance, lost part of your herd to disease, a person was entitled to some kind of insurance relief from the Hreppur. So it also looks like they started at an early stage to build some kind of communal network too. And the extent to which that is voluntary, that is something I am unsure about. At least what it looks like is, at least with the church, of course, then it's not a voluntary system any longer. That is, you are mandated to pay this tax, period.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So Edward, did you have any final thoughts on that, or should I switch over to Trish, because I know that she has some questions?
I'm good right now. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right, Trish, the floor is yours. I know you had some thoughts and questions.
Okay, so I wanted to go back a little bit to the idea. You said there were two governments, one that existed on the east and one that existed on the west. And I'm really curious, sort of what were the sort of hallmarks of each one in terms of how they were structured, or do you even know this? How they were structured, what was the difference between the two, how they functioned, what things they were in charge of?
So I don't know if it was my wording of it, but just to clarify, they didn't exist in the east and the west. They both existed in the western part of Iceland.
Oh, okay.
And they were from the very beginning established. It looked like so. What they were, to the extent that we know much about them, is that they were established by powerful individuals and the group that came with them for a region, and this would be a similar type of assembly as the one that is established at Thingvellir later on, and again, it's a to an extent it's a representational system. Where we have at least the landholders, those with property, they have the right to be represented. At least the males. One of the things that we see in the Icelandic laws is that women don't have access to representation through any other than a male relative, which creates some curious situations too when we start seeing women being in possession of property, because that happens too. And aside from that, what we should also consider is that there is a small handful of women who come to Iceland in the early times and take land too. I think it is 11 or 15 or something around that, like a very small portion of the early land takers were women, and yeah, they had that problem of the lack of representation in the government. But aside from that, we don't know much about it. I mean, some of the saga literature tells us a little bit about various family feuds happening with sort of these assembly sites as sort of the backdrop for that. So what this might indicate is perhaps that that because there were these regional assemblies, regional governments to begin with, a lot of discord came out of that. There was a lot of maybe fighting over borders in different ways, fighting over dominance between different important clans, and then eventually people reach some kind of agreement to establish the assembly site at Þingvellir, and then from there we have more of an even balance between the many chieftains that have sort of claimed land in Iceland. But what has? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so one of the things that I am a student of, or at least used to be very heavily, and, you know, as, you know, life goes on, you put aside one subject for the other, but I'm pretty fairly versed in Irish history. And there sounds like there's a lot of similarities here between how Irish society worked before you got a lot of the migrations in. You know, sort of the you know, I'm hearing things about property raids and chieftains, and it's you know, and ultimately, you know, people coming together and forming at least some kind of proto-government. You know, this is very, and I mean, there are similarities except for the harshness of the land. There are similarities in terms of, you know, the size and the sort of scope of the land that you have with Ireland, and the scope and what you have with Iceland. And I just find it fascinating that I'm hearing these sort of themes repeat in terms of Icelandic history. I'm not sure that was really a question as much as an observation here. I'm very fascinated by this. So it's incredible.
Yeah, you know, one thing that I do, and in the research that I work with, I often use various Polynesian cultures as reference points for understanding Iceland in different ways in the pre-Christian era, because there are, you know, despite the differences, there are also many interesting similarities that you can compare with. And Ireland is also a great example for you know, augmenting your understanding of the early Icelandic society.